Blake mansion stood like a cathedral of wealth on the edge of the city, its tall arched windows catching the late afternoon light and scattering it across marble floors polished to a mirror's sheen. From the outside, it looked like the perfect picture of stability: stone walls, wrought iron gates,
Oh, yes.
gardens trimmed with a precision that matched the man who owned them. But inside, the air carried a stillness that didn't belong to a home. It was the kind of quiet that pressed in around you, heavy and deliberate, a quiet born from absence rather than peace. Alexander Blake moved through those echoing halls, as if they were extensions of his own body-measured steps, straight spine, gaze that always seemed fixed on some invisible point ahead. At 47, he was a man who had mastered the art of control. Every tie knot sat at the perfect angle. Every word in business meetings landed with the weight of intent. The board of Blake Industries saw him as unshakable. The press admired his composure. And the few who knew him personally understood that precision wasn't just a habit, it was a shield. Emily Carter had learned to live within that shield without ever finding a way inside it. Was 38, a restorer of rare books. Hands more accustomed to the brittle edges of parchment than to the touch of the man she called her husband. Her life in the mansion existed on the far side of its sprawling layout, in a smaller wing with a balcony that overlooked the gardens. It was quiet there, and she filled the silence with the scent of old paper, the whisper of turned pages, the careful dance of brush over faded ink. They'd been married for 2 years. On paper, it was elegant, a union that seemed to fit neatly into the world's idea of sophistication. In reality, it was a contract neither of them cared to explain. They attended charity galas together, stood side by side for photographs, and nodded politely at one another across tables dressed in fine china and crystal. At night, Alexander retreated to the master suite. Emily returned to her modest balcony room. Between them lay not only the length of the mansion's corridors, but the kind of distance no architecture could measure. Dinner was the same each evening, ritual performed without conversation. The sound of silverware against porcelain was the only music in the room. He drank his red wine slowly, methodically. She sipped her chamomile tea, the steam curling into the space between them. Sometimes her eyes would lift from her plate, watching. The way he leaned back in his chair, the way his gaze seemed to rest not on her but somewhere behind her. And yet, there were moments small, almost imperceptible, when she would catch him watching her. It was never long enough to feel like connection, but just enough to unsettle the quiet she'd taught herself to live in. She often wondered if he would ever truly see her, not as the woman who shared his last name for the sake of appearances, but as someone who had her own storms, her own stories. And Alexander, though he would never admit it aloud, found himself wondering the same if he had the courage to look past the structure he'd built and let her see him in return. Neither spoke it, neither moved. The mansion stood between them, cold and perfect, as if waiting for one of them to be the first crack in the silence. The night, the air in the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Arts Center shimmered with soft golden light, and the quiet hum of conversations woven between the clinking of crystal glasses. Alexander Blake stood near the far end surveying the room. With the same sharp awareness he brought to the boardroom, every investor, every piece of art, every subtle exchange carefully noted and stored away. His tailored suit was perfect, his expression unreadably. Carter moved somewhere in that crowd. Though not in his direct line of sight, she had chosen a deep teal dress that draped over her shoulders and flowed softly with her movements. Her hair was pinned loosely, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She was speaking to someone, and even from across the room, Alexander caught the sound of her laughter, a sound he had not heard in his own home for 2 years. It was Richard Stevens, a man Alexander knew well from the cultural investment market, charismatic, magnetic, with an easy smile that drew people in. Richard was leaning slightly toward her, telling a story that made her laugh again, and Alexander noticed her hand rest briefly on Richard's arm as if the gesture had slipped out naturally. He felt it then, a sudden pull in his chest. It was not anger exactly, not even the clean sharpness of jealousy. It was something older, deeper, a heat under his ribs that pushed him forward before his mind could interfere. Crossed the floor with steady, measured steps, each one somehow louder in his head than the murmured voices around him. When he reached her, he placed his hand on the small of her back. "No," The first deliberate touch in years. Emily turned to him, her eyes briefly widening before settling into a composed smile. "Evening, Richard. I see you've met my wife, Alexander," said his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made Richard straighten slightly as. "We were just discussing manuscript restoration. Emily is fascinating," Richard replied, his gaze shifting between them with something unreadable behind his polite tonal. Alexander did not break eye contact with Richard, but his hands stayed on Emily's back, not heavy, not possessive, but certain. It was not a gesture for the cameras or the guests. It was a claim. Quiet, unmistakable message. Emily felt the warmth of it through the thin fabric of her dress, and for a moment forgot the art, the crowd, the world beyond that single point of connection. On the way home, the city lights slid across the glass of the limousine in fractured patterns, neither of them speaking at first. The silence was different now, tighter, almost electric. "You seem to enjoy your conversation with Richard," Alexander said at last, his gaze fixed on the passing blur outside. "He was kind and curious about my work," Emily answered evenly. Alexander nodded slowly, then spoke in a tone that was softer but edged with something she could not quite name. "I should have done this sooner, done what she asked, shown the world that you are my wife." The words lingered between them, heavy with meanings she was not sure she could untangle yet. And when the car stopped at the mansion, he stepped out first and turned to offer his hand. She hesitated only a moment before taking it, feeling that same warmth again. This time she did not pull away, and in that quiet gesture, a line they had never crossed began to fade. Morning light spilled through the tall dining room windows, catching the faint glint of silver on the table. Emily stepped in, expecting the usual emptiness. Alexander never ate breakfast here. He was always gone before she woke, but today he was seated at the head of the table, his jacket draped neatly over the back of the chair and a folded newspaper resting beside his plate. "Good morning," he said, lifting his eyes to her, and there was something in his tone that was neither the formal politeness she knew nor the distant courtesy of public events. It was warmer, almost careful. She answered softly, "Good morning," and moved toward her usual place at the far end, but his hand lifted in a small gesture. "Sit here beside me. I thought we could have coffee together." Today she hesitated, but walked to the seat next to him. The coffee was already poured, one spoon of sugar in hers, just as she liked it, a detail she had not imagined. He noticed. He leaned back, watching her take the first sip. "Did you ever finish restoring that Cervantes volume from the National Library auction last month?" She blinked, surprised. He remembered. "I barely managed to touch it, but yes, I was part of the restoration." He nodded slowly. "I saw a photograph of you there. You seemed alive in that room." Emily smiled faintly. Old books have a way of giving back the stories they carry. Every stain, every crease is a whisper from another time. Alexander studied her for a long moment, as though weighing something in his mind. "I would like to see your studio one day if you would allow it." She looked down at her cup, unsure what to say. That was not the Alexander she had known for 2 years. That evening, when he asked her to attend an intimate art showing hosted by one of his business partners, she almost refused, but the way he stood in the doorway waiting for her answer made her pause. "I would like you there, Emily," he said simply, no pretense, no command. The gallery was quiet when they arrived, abstract paintings glowing under low light. Alexander stayed by her side, moving at her pace. He asked her thoughts about a jagged steel sculpture. She said it looked like the collapse of identity, and he gave a low laugh, saying he had only seen twisted metal before, but now he would look closer later. They found themselves standing in a corner with glasses of wine. The room felt smaller when he leaned in and said, "You see things I don't see, Emily. I am starting to wonder how much else I have missed." She met his gaze just long enough to feel the weight of it before someone approached to speak with him, but the moment stayed with her back. At the mansion, as she passed the open door of her reading room, he appeared holding 2 glasses of wine. "I thought we could toast to the different night we had." Let him in, and for the first time in 2 years they sat in her space, surrounded by her books, the air carrying the faint scent of leather and paper. His eyes lingered on the shelves as though he were mapping a part of her. He had never been allowed to enter before, and she wondered if this was the beginning of something she had long stopped expecting. Rain swept against the tall windows of the exhibition hall, blurring the city lights into streaks of silver and gold. Inside the new Blake Industries cultural wing, guests moved between displays, speaking in low, refined tones. Emily stood beside a glass case containing a centuries-old manuscript, its delicate pages spread open under soft light. She felt strangely at home here, yet aware of the man who had brought her Alexander. Stayed close not as a shadow, but as a deliberate presence introducing her two donors, scholars and executives, with a quiet pride that was new every time he said her name. His voice carried a weight that made her pulse quicken. They stopped in front of a massive oil painting, and he asked her opinion. She studied the "Seen a storm crashing over a lone ship? It feels like survival," she said. Calm on the surface, chaos underneath. He looked at her as if she had just revealed something far beyond the painting. When the formal speeches began, Alexander guided her toward the front, and when it was his turn to speak, he gestured toward her in front of the entire room. "For the curation phase of our newest partnership, we will rely fully on Emily Carter Blake, because no one understands memory and history like she does." There was a murmur in the crowd, and Emily felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She caught his eyes for only a second, but in that second she saw the truth. He was not doing this for show. After the event, the limousine ride was quiet but charged the city. Slid past in wet flashes of light and shadow. "You changed something tonight," she said softly. Without looking at her, he replied, "Maybe. I am just finally showing what I should have from the beginning." When they reached the mansion, he surprised her by not retreating to his wing. Instead, he followed her to the small studio at the back. The room smelled of aged paper and lavender. He moved slowly between the tables, touching nothing but taking in everything. "This is where the magic happens," he said, and she laughed, telling him it was just a mess. He stepped closer, examining the tools, brushes, and bindings. "It is a kind of alchemy. You turn what time tried to erase into something whole again." They reached for the same fragile volume at the same moment, and their hands brushed. His fingers lingered a second longer than necessary before he let go. She pulled back, but the air between them had shifted. He met her gaze, and for the first time in years, she felt the possibility of something unsaid, something waiting to be spoken that night. She could not sleep. No. Her mind replayed the way he had introduced her, the way his hand had touched hers without hesitation. On the other side of the mansion, Alexander sat at his desk, a blank sheet. Before him, he picked up a pencil and began to draw, not a building, not a business plan, but a face with soft features and watchful eyes. He did not need to look at a photograph to know every line. It was Emily, and in the quiet of that storm-soaked night, he realized he was no longer willing to live as if she were just part of a contract there. Morning sun spilled across the dining room table, catching the rim of 2 coffee cups instead of 1. Emily paused in the doorway. Alexander was already. Their sleeves rolled back, a faint shadow under his eyes, but his posture easy. He gestured to the chair beside him. "Sit, we should eat before the day swallows us whole." She sat more from curiosity than hunger and noticed a folded note beside her plate. "Good luck with the Spanish manuscript," it read in his sharp, deliberate handwriting. She looked up at him, but he was already sipping his coffee, as if the gesture needed no explanation. Over the next week, small signs began to appear like threads pulling her into a different rhythm. A lunch invitation slipped between meetings. A late afternoon walk through the garden when he should have been in the city. A simple question at night about her work, as if he wanted to understand the language of her world. One evening, he brought her a book from a second-hand store wrapped in brown paper. "I thought of you when I saw it," he said. She unwrapped it to find a worn copy of Jane Eyre, her favorite. "From years ago, it has a quote you once mentioned to me," he said quietly. She met his eyes, startled that he had remembered one. Rainy afternoon, she heard footsteps in the hall, and he appeared at her studio door holding 2 steaming mugs. "Hot chocolate," he said. When she raised an eyebrow, "I thought coffee would be too bitter for weather like this." She laughed softly, taking the cup from his hand. He walked to the work table, studying the fragments of an old binding. "You give new life to things that should have been lost," he murmured. She glanced at him, and for a fleeting moment it felt as though he were speaking about more than paper and glue. Later that week, he invited her to see the progress on the new cultural branch of the company. The elevator doors opened onto an entire floor of climate-controlled rooms, polished shelves, and lighting that shifted with the time of day. "All of this," he said, "because of what you told me about preserving what is rare." She turned slowly, taking it in. "This is more than I imagined, and you are more than I imagined," he replied without hesitation. That night the air between them was heavy with unspoken things as they walked through the garden. The lights from the house spilled across the grass. He stopped and looked at her directly. "Emily, I want to know. You in the present, not just in the photographs or polite conversations?" She did not answer right away. The sound of rain starting against the leaves filled the space between them. Her fingers brushed his briefly, and she felt him hold the contact. For a heartbeat longer than necessary, neither of them spoke, but in that quiet touch both knew they had crossed another unseen line. And there would be no way to return to the untouched distance that had defined the last 2 years the road to Willow Creek Ranch wound through miles of open fields. The horizon painted in soft blues and golds. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her gaze on the passing landscape. Alexander drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on the gearshift. His silence different from the one she had known for years. It was not cold now. It was weighted as if he carried something he had decided to share, but was waiting for the right moment. When they reached the ranch, the air smelled of pine and distant rain. The old wooden house stood warm against the expanse of land, its porch wide and inviting. Alexander led her inside, showing her the rooms with a quiet pride. When they reached the upstairs, he stopped at a door. "I chose this one for you, the sunset. Through that window is something you never forget." She stepped inside, the view stretching endlessly over the fields, and felt a pull in her chest that she could not name. That afternoon they walked the property, crossing a shallow creek until they reached an ancient oak tree, its branches arched wide, casting a shade that felt like its own private world. Alexander leaned against the trunk, watching her. "You know, my mother used to read letters aloud here. She believed love needed space to breathe, or it would suffocate." Emily looked at him, searching his face. "Do you believe that?" He hesitated. "I did not know what love was until I wanted you to look at me with the same eyes you look at your books." The words landed between them like a stone, still water sending ripples through the air. She took a step closer, and for the first time she saw something unguarded in his eyes. They stood there without speaking until the sun began to sink, painting the fields in amber light. That evening they sat on the porch, a blanket over her shoulders, a cup of tea in her hands. Alexander returned from inside, carrying an old vinyl record player. The music that spilled out was slow, almost haunting. "Do you remember that quote from Jane Eyre?" he asked. "The thorn and the flower." She nodded. "You showed me that a person can be both and still be whole." His hand lifted to her face, fingers brushing her jaw, as if afraid she might vanish if he touched her too quickly. "I see you now, Emily. I am sorry for all the time I did not see." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, then deepening, as though making up for every word they had never spoken. Every moment they had passed in silence. They parted only when the night grew too cool to ignore each. Went to their own room, but the air in the house had changed. The emptiness no longer felt permanent for the first time. Emily lay in bed, knowing the man down the hall was no longer just a name on paper, but someone who had chosen to see her, and she wondered if this was the real beginning of their marriage. The morning after they returned from Willow Creek, the air in the mansion felt lighter, but it did not last. By afternoon, a plain white envelope with no return address lay on the desk in Emily's studio. She opened it without thinking. Inside were several folded pages, heavy with ink and official seals. The first line stopped her cold. "Every contract has a price. Do you know what yours was?" Her hands tightened around the paper as she read bank records, transfer receipts, legal documents, all marked with dates from weeks before their wedding. Her family's mortgage erased, her brother's business debts cleared, every number stamped with the same payer. Blake Holdings at the bottom of the final page was a signature she had never seen in person, but knew instantly. Robert Blake Sr. Her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and understanding. The numbers were real, the dates were exact, and the truth settled over her with a slow, cold weight. The marriage she thought she had chosen had been sealed with a hidden bargain. She felt her knees weaken, but forced herself to stay standing when Alexander appeared in the doorway holding 2 coffees. She could not hide it. She held the envelope out to him without a word. He took it, and as his eyes moved down the page, his expression shifted from confusion to grim recognition. "Did you know?" she asked, her voice even, but cutting through the space between them. "No," he said immediately. "I swear I did not know. This was my father's doing so." "You were telling me that our marriage was just a transaction to save my family." He stepped forward, but she stepped back. Emily, please, if I had known I would have told you. 8. I never would have let you walk into this blind. Her heart was pounding, not from anger alone, but from the sting of feeling stripped of choice. That is exactly what hurts. I didn't choose, and now I don't know if anything we've lived was real. He closed his eyes for a long moment as though bracing himself. I will find out exactly what happened. I will give you the truth. I don't want corporate explanations, she said. I want to know who I have been married to because I started to believe in you. Shay turned and walked past him, leaving the smell of coffee and the sound of her footsteps fading into the long corridor. Alexander stood alone with the documents in his hands. The taste of her words sharpened his mouth. The silence between them that night was different from the one they had lived in before. It was not the emptiness of strangers, it was the silence after something breaks, a silence that waits to see if either person will try to put the pieces back together. The days after the discovery moved slowly, heavy with an unspoken tension. Emily buried herself in restoration work, staying late in her studio long after the lights in the rest of the mansion had gone dark. One afternoon, she was leaving the university library after a guest lecture when she heard her name. Richard Stevens stepped out from a column of stone, his tailored coat catching the breeze. Emily Carter, or should I say Emily Blake, he said with that polished smile that never reached his eyes. She stopped, wary. What are you doing here? No coincidence, he replied. I heard you were speaking, and I wanted to listen. I have always admired your work. He handed her a small bouquet of wildflowers, and she hesitated before taking them out of politeness. You seem more distant than usual. Is everything all right? She gave a tight smile. I am reorganizing. Richard's gaze sharpened. Reorganizing is only the first step, especially when you realize the ground beneath you was built on arrangements, not choices. Her spine straightened. What exactly are you suggesting? He shrugged as if it were a harmless conversation. The market has ears, Emily. People notice when a powerful man starts showing his emotions. Some of us even dig deeper. He reached into his pocket, producing a small envelope sealed in wax. I am not here to cause trouble. Read this alone, then decide what to do. Sometimes freedom arrives disguised as a hard choice. He pressed the envelope into her hand and walked away, leaving her with the scent of the flowers and a knot in her stomach under the shade of an old oak. On campus, she broke the seal. Inside was a short letter written in clean, precise lines. If you want to keep living someone else's story, do nothing. If you want to write your own, there is a place for you. Far from the shadow of agreements, think. Carefully, her fingers tightened. She tore the paper into 4 pieces, letting them scatter into the wind. This was not an act of support. It was a wedge meant to break what little remained between her and Alexander. That evening, she returned to the mansion earlier than expected. Alexander was on the porch, a closed book in his lap. He rose when he saw her. I ran into Richard today, she said. I know, he answered evenly. He came by the company earlier in the week, pretending to be interested in our cultural division, but I knew he was probing. He gave me a letter implying I should walk away from you. Alexander's eyes searched hers. And do you want to? Emily held his gaze steady. If I wanted to run, I would have already. I am not someone who leaves when I love, but I need time to understand how to forgive and how to move forward from here. His shoulders eased, though his voice was thick with something close to relief. I would wait 1,000 years if I had to. She did not answer with words. Instead, she stepped past him into the house, leaving the scent of wildflowers behind on the evening air. 3 mornings after the encounter with Richard, Emily entered the dining room to find Alexander already there, a leather folder resting beside his plate. He stood when she approached, pulling out her chair before sliding the folder toward her. Inside was a proposal for a new division of Blake Industries, an independent fund to support families in crisis, with one clear line at the top: help should never cost freedom. She looked up at him, unsure of what to say. This is not a board project, he told her. This is mine, and I want you to lead it. Words struck deeper than she expected. He was not offering her a gesture meant to smooth things over. He was offering her something tangible, something she could claim as her own. She nodded slowly, but said nothing. The silence between them was no longer brittle. It was cautious, like 2 people learning to move without reopening an old wound later. That week, she visited her parents, needing to hear their truth without the filter of memory. They told her how representatives from Blake Holdings had appeared with the offer. How the relief had felt like rescue, how they had believed she understood. And agreed. Emily listened to every word, feeling both the sting of betrayal and the quiet pride in their voices. They were proud of the woman she had become, even if the path had been built on a bargain she never knew. When she returned, Alexander was in her studio flipping through a restored manuscript. He looked up and smiled faintly. They confirmed everything, didn't they? She nodded and replied softly, and they said, if things had been different, I might never have met you. His eyes darkened. With something like gratitude, I do not want our story to be about debt or rescue. I want it to be about rebuilding over. The following days, their routines began to shift. Breakfast together became normal. Evening walks through the garden happened. Without being planned, he would bring her updates on the cultural branch they now shared, asking for her input before making decisions. At night, they sometimes sat in the reading room, in companionable silence, the kind of quiet that comes only after truth has been spoken. One evening, on the porch under the low glow of lantern light, Emily turned to him. I will try, she said. Simply try to trust again. Try to see you as you are now, not as the man I thought you were. He reached for her hand, his touch steady. I will match every step you take with one of my own. No rush, no demands. We will build this together. The moment was not dramatic yet. It held more power than any vow. They were no longer holding on out of duty. They were holding on because they had chosen to stay, and the choice itself carried a weight neither of them could deny. Spring arrived with a soft wind that carried the scent of fresh earth and blooming grass. Alexander suggested they return to Willow Creek, just the two of them. No cameras, no board members, no crowd. Emily hesitated but agreed. The ranch looked the same as before, yet it felt different now, as if the land itself remembered the words they had exchanged beneath its sky. On the morning of their second day, he led her to the field behind the house, where rows of wildflowers had begun to spread. Small wooden arch had been set up, draped in simple white cloth. There were only a handful of chairs, her parents, her brother, and his wife, and one of Alexander's oldest friends. The ceremony would be quiet, intimate, the way they wished it had been. From the start, they stood facing each other beneath the arch, the wind tugging gently at Emily's veil. Alexander spoke first. For 2 years we were married only on paper. I thought that was enough, but you taught me it was nothing. I want to strip away the image, the fear, the silence. I want to stand here with you without walls and without terms. Emily felt her throat tighten as she answered. When I married you, I believed I was saving my family, but now I see I was saving myself too. You taught me that being seen can be frightening, but it also heals. Today, I stay because I want to, not because I must. They sealed their vows with a kiss that held none of the hesitation of their first. It was steady, sure, a promise made in full sight of those who mattered most. After the small celebration, they walked through the field hand in hand until they reached the fence, where they had once spoken about being too late. Do you remember what you told me here? He asked. She smiled. You said you thought it was too late, and I told you it was not now. I know it never was. As the sun began to set, Emily noticed movement near the edge of the property. A black car waited just beyond the gate, and in its shadow she recognized the shape of Robert Blake Sr. Alexander followed her gaze and his jaw tightened. He excused himself, walking toward the gate. The wind carried none of the words, but Emily saw the way. Robert gestured toward the ceremony site, and the way Alexander shook his head firmly. After a final sharp exchange, Robert turned away, stepping back into the car. The gates closed. Alexander returned. There was a clarity in his eyes that had not been there before. He said quietly he wanted to attend, to claim his place. I told him no, this is ours, not his. Emily felt something deep inside settle at last. The man beside her was no longer divided between two worlds. He had chosen, and his choice was her. That night, as they sat on the porch, the air cooling around them, Emily leaned into him. If anyone asked, I would tell them the most important day of my life was the day you asked me to have coffee. And I said yes, he finished with a small smile. Sometimes love begins there, and sometimes it begins 2 years late, but still right on time.